Hello again, everyone. I am José Ramón Enriquez, PhD student in political economy and government. I am happy to present our next panel, Moving Forward, the Future of USMCA and US-Mexico Relations. The beginning of the Biden administration in the United States generates new opportunities and challenges for the bilateral relationship between the United States and Mexico. One of the most important obstacles is working together on achieving economic recovery and implementing the new North American Trade Agreement. Therefore, this panel will discuss the key challenges for this new trade agreement, the accumulated knowledge from the previous agreement, NAFTA, the holes and gray areas in the existing legislation, and also the processes of restoring value chains and ensuring economic recovery. I am therefore happy to present the panelists for this conversation. Doctora Graciela Márquez. Graciela received a PhD in economic history from Harvard University. For 20 years, Dr. Márquez was a professor at El Colegio de México. In December 2018, she became the first woman to lead the Ministry of the Economy in Mexico. In January 2021, Dr. Márquez joined the National Institute for Statistics and Geography as a board member. Thank you so much, Dr. Márquez, for being here. Alejandrina Salcedo. Alejandrina received her PhD in economics from Stanford University. She has been Director of Economic Measurement and Manager of the Real Sector Research Division at Banco de México. She has also worked as chief economist for the Mexican Ministry of Finance. She is currently the Director of Prices, Regional Economies, and Information Analysis at Banco de México. Thank you so much, Alejandrina, for being here. Álvaro Santos. Álvaro received an LLM and SJD from Harvard Law School. He is professor of law and faculty director of the Center for the Advancement of the Rule of Law in the Americas, Corolla, at Georgetown Law. He teaches and writes in the areas of international trade, economic development, transnational labor law, and drug policy. In 2018, he served as deputy chief negotiator of the USMCA agreement for the newly elected government of Mexico. Thank you, Alvaro, for being here. Roberto Velasco. Roberto holds a master in public policy from the University of Chicago. He has served as a strategy and policy coordinator to Pro-Mexico's NAFTA regional direction in Washington, D.C. He has served as the Secretariat of Foreign Affairs Director General for Public Affairs, and more recently, he serves as acting Undersecretary for North America. Thank you, Roberto, for being here. And last but not least, Professor Gordon Hanson. Gordon Hanson is the Peter Wertheim Professor in Urban Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. He is also Research Associate at the NBER and co-editor of the Journal of Economic Perspectives. Professor Hanson received his PhD in economics from MIT. And prior to joining Harvard in 2020, he served on the economics faculties of UC San Diego, University of Michigan, and University of Texas. In his scholarship, Professor Hanson specializes in international trade, international migration, and economic geography. Without further ado, please, Professor Hanson, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Jose Ramon. It's really great to be part of this panel. We have a distinguished group of folks who have deep experience in economic policymaking in Mexico and in dealing with the United States. And I'd like to jump right in and ask each of the panelists to make some opening remarks to set the stage for then a broader discussion. And in terms of framing those remarks, Mexico again confronts a new presidential administration in the United States with a new set of trade priorities. It would be understandable if policymakers in the country are feeling a bit of whiplash. The Trump administration took trade relations with Mexico one direction, and now the Biden administration is contemplating other changes. So I would love to get your thoughts on the challenges that you think the Biden administration's trade agenda presents to Mexico, and also in particular, what you think would be constructive for Mexico to suggest to the United States as it tries to figure out what it's going to do about China, which is perhaps the overriding issue in trade policy. So with that as ground rules, I'll ask you to take about 3 minutes or so, and we will go in alphabetical order. So Graciela, it is my pleasure to ask you to start us off.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. It is a real pleasure to join the Mexican Conference 2021, organized by UMA. I every year I have followed these conferences since they really provide an overview of many of crucial topics for Mexican development. Let me start by saying, or to provide some perspective on what the USMCA means in terms of trade and in terms of possibilities of development for Mexico. Trade in Mexico represents 78% of GDP, reflecting that Mexico is a very open economy. Mexico is the 8th largest global exporter and first in Latin America, and it's the 9th larger importer. Sorry, the previous figure is exporter. And Mexico has signed 13 free trade agreements with 50 countries. So just to put in perspective that in this array of free trade agreements, of course, USMCA is the most important one. USMCA taking in total represents $23 trillion and $1 trillion in GDP and $1 trillion in trade. Bilateral trade with the US since NAFTA was signed grew by 7 times. So in the past 27 years, Mexico built a very important export platform. And there is no doubt that trade integration worked during NAFTA. But perhaps more importantly, there is not only an export platform, but there is a productive integration in North America. And that's exactly what USMCA tried to preserve, the productive integration, not only the trade integration. And that is a key issue. Now, USMCA entered into force on July 1st in the middle of one of the worst health crises in a century, and also in the middle of a huge economic downturn globally. So what does NAFTA provided? Certainty, clear rules, it maintained free trade and preserved the possibility of a more competitive North American region. How do we move from there to the global competitiveness? We need to enhance competitiveness and enhance productivity throughout the region. I'll stop here to listen to the other participants in this panel and then to follow up on some questions. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you, Graciela. You raised some really important issues regarding the challenges that maintaining and accelerating competitiveness represents. So Alejandrina, I wonder if we can turn to you. And I might ask, knowing a bit about your expertise, if you might throw in some of your thoughts, what US-Mexico economic integration has meant for the different regional labor markets in Mexico and the particular challenges that presents as Mexico tries to define the next stage of US-Mexico.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel. I'm going to share some slides because I think they will be helpful. If I could please share my screen. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, well, let me start by saying that NAFTA strengthened the economic ties between Mexico, Canada, and the United States. It has allowed for a very strong, for constructing a very strong supply chains in the region, and also allowing for the whole region and the countries in particular to participate in global value chains. So I find it very important to talk a little bit about what are global value chains. And let me start by saying that, well, technological advances have allowed for the fragmentation of the productive process. This means that each stage of production can be performed in a different geographic location, in a different country in particular. So that means that trade is no longer about exchanging cars for apples, as maybe we have learned in school, but it's now characterized about the specialization in different tasks. So a country performs one task in which they are good at, and another country in a different task. So let me put an example. Let's think about trying to build a car. So one country is good at painting the car, and another good is good at putting the electronic parts together, and another one and assembling the tires. So what happens is that one country performs one task and another one performs another task. Therefore, and this is crucial, trade becomes about exchanging tasks, not about exchanging finished goods. And this means that goods can cross the border multiple times. So this means that it is very important to have low trade barriers. And this means that it's not only low tariffs, but it's also about having an institutional framework that allows for a contract enforcement, because also you can imagine that firms will be exchanging knowledge or intellectual property or technology as well. So because of these characteristics of trade, a modern trade agreement is about creating an institutional framework to support this type of production. And that's precisely what NAFTA has done. It has allowed for a deep economic integration by eliminating trade barriers. And again, I want to emphasize that this is not only about tariffs, and it has constructed a deep regulatory and institutional change to promote investment flows. So now under NAFTA, the countries have transitioned from being trade partners to being investment and production partners. Now, several studies have shown that trade flows, that NAFTA has allowed for an increase in trade flows between the three countries, as Dr. Márquez had already mentioned, and also net welfare. And several studies have talked about these. I want to give just an example. It's not the only thing that has happened, but it's probably one easy one to understand. Consumers now have access to a larger variety of goods and to lower prices thanks to the market discipline effects of trade openness. Professor Hansen was also mentioning about some changes in the labor market, which are also relevant, pushing some workers into having higher wages, although we're going to talk about some other concerns related to inequality within the framework. Now, USMCA is an opportunity to continue promoting benefits brought about by NAFTA. And remember, this is about being production and investment partners. And therefore, the key point is, what is the institutional framework? If you look at some of the new chapters that USMCA introduced relative to NAFTA, you can see that we have new chapters on rules regarding digital trade, regarding labor rights, regarding protection and environment, and also regarding anti-corruption measures. So why should we continue promoting the global value chains, and why we should be excited about the new USMCA? Well, because it encourages investment, and we know that investment is good for growth. Then also because it magnifies the productivity gains from trade. So remember, this is about being efficient in the different tasks that the production process requires. And so we get a lot of productivity by dividing the tasks, and also by facilitating the transfer of knowledge and information and technology within firms. And the resulting increased competitiveness, the resulting increase in productivity, in turn, increases competitiveness in the region as a whole. So the whole region becomes more competitive, and that might also give a hint of what Professor Hansen was asking about, how the region can become more competitive in the world as a whole. Now, I don't want to seem naive, and I think it's very important to mention some of the risks of this type of arrangement. So the first one has to do with specialization versus diversification. And you know there's a trade-off between specialization, which generates efficiency gains, and diversification, which reduces risks. Then possible disruptions. You know that domestic economies may be vulnerable to shocks happening in other countries. But then here, I think it's very important to emphasize that the solution to this concern is not to give, not to turn down all the gains from trade, or not to say that we don't want an agreement anymore, but to try to be creative and to find solutions to these possible risks. And I just put some words on the table, which is international cooperation or contingency plans. And finally, and very importantly, I think there's a risk of inequality. This might have different dimensions, and you might have learned in your trade classes that some people may actually be better off without the agreement, despite the country as a whole having increased welfare in aggregate. So the solution again is not to get rid of the trade agreements, or not to get rid of the efficiency gains that we can obtain with the trade agreements, but rather to be creative and address the inequalities that it might originate. And I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alejandrina. That puts a great set of issues on the table and highlights the significance of global value chains as we think about the potential for the US and Mexico together, along with Canada as a partner, to break in to new markets globally. Alvaro, I hope we can turn to you next, and you have a great perspective to bring to us, because you both come with the experience of having helped negotiate the USMCA. And then I know through your work with the Wilson Center and UC San Diego have been doing a lot of thinking about a template for US-Mexico economic relations, and in particular, this new emphasis on labor that the Biden administration is likely to bring. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gordon, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to UMA for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here. So I do see USMCA as an opportunity to renew the North American economic integration and to revamp or even to transform the US-Mexico partnership. But I don't want to echo now the merits of the integration that my colleagues have already put forward. I'm going to focus on the other aspect, which is that I think a big lesson of NAFTA is also that it didn't work as a development strategy. That is that despite its initial hopes, it didn't really manage to create the growth that we had expected, and that the prospects for USMCA in terms of growth may be limited, according to, for example, the US International Trade Commission in the US. And so that it's clear that USMCA will need to be accompanied by domestic economic strategies, both in the US and Mexico, if you want it to be good for development. And I agree that the USMCA can be a useful framework, but I think that we need to not oversell it and to see what are those domestic strategies that we need to put in place. And Gordon, to answer to your initial question, I think that what's becoming clear is that the Biden administration's trade policy is not going to be a return to the pre-Trump administration. So it's not going to be a return to Obama's trade policy. It's actually going to be in some ways a continuation and a refocus of the previous administration's policy. This is clear, I think, in what the Biden administration just announced as the America's Supply Chains Executive Order 4 days ago. So there's going to be an emphasis on reshoring, on domestic production. There's going to be an emphasis, as you mentioned, on thinking about trade as good for workers, not only for consumers. And so there's going to be a rebalancing of the rights of capital and labor as well. And I think we can see already some of those aspects in the USMCA, and I'm going to be happy to talk about them and develop those ideas further. But let me just say two more things. One is that I think part of the problem of what happened in NAFTA relates to two issues. One is the dual or the polarized nature of the Mexican economy, and the other is the repressive labor system. And I'm happy to talk about those in my subsequent interventions. Let me just finish. And I don't mean here to throw a monkey wrench, but let me finish by saying, I think there are two other aspects that are really important to the US-Mexico relations and are deeply economic, but we've become used to thinking about those as in the purview or the domain of homeland security or national security, and thinking about those only through the lens of either national security or criminal justice. And so here I want to refer to one, movement of labor or migration, right? Where I think that what we've seen is that while NAFTA has been really good for movement of goods, services, and capital, we've kept labor mostly fixed formally. And so it's proceeded in an undocumented basis with the acquiescence of American employers and both governments. And the US policy has fluctuated between don't ask, don't tell, and no holds barred. I think that it's clear that movement of labor is a result of the design of North American integration because of the displacement of labor and the market forces, the pull and push of demand and supply. And so I think we need to formalize those flows. And that would be good for both economic reasons, but also for national security reasons for the US. I think Gordon is an example of someone who actually deals with both aspects, trade and migration, but we're not used to thinking about these things together in the policy domain. And this is a plea for us to think about in those terms when we think about the US-Mexico relationship. And the other aspect is the transnational market for illegal drugs, which is also a huge part of the economic exchange. It's also the result of the prohibition. So it's a result of our regulation in the harshest form, which is prohibition. And it's created horrific effects for Mexico and also for the United States, by the way. And so I think that that needs to be part of the agenda, of the bilateral agenda, when thinking about economic relations and a renewed partnership, not fragment it or think about it in this sort of schizo or kind of almost schizophrenic way, but think about it as part and parcel of the same economic relationship. And here I have to say, Canada has already legalized marijuana for recreational use. The US, there's like more than 35 states that have allowed it now for medical use, 14 for recreational use. The Biden administration has made it a point to decriminalize marijuana at the federal level, and Mexico is about to pass a regulation of marijuana as well. So marijuana could be a good focus point to start thinking about illicit drugs and how to regulate them at the transnational level. So let me leave it there for now.
That was fantastic. You put a provocative set of points on the table. You're mentioning that NAFTA was not a development strategy. Kind of takes me back to my youth when NAFTA was being sold as something of an economic miracle drug on both sides of the border. And the irresponsibility of those promises has really kind of come home to roost politically and economically in recent decades. I thought it very interesting you put labor on the table. If we compare the North American economic relationship to the EU, which has promoted the four freedoms, there is one big glaring difference, and that is North American economic integration has never been about the movement of labor, but it's hard to think about the economies interacting without taking that into account. So Roberto, that brings us to you. It's your job to solve all of these problems. So tell us what Mexico should do. Tell us what the US should do.
Thank you very much, Gordon, and thanks to for the opportunity to participate in this discussion, especially with such esteemed colleagues as Secretary Márquez and Alvaro Santos, with whom I have the privilege to work in the past in many different topics when Dr. Márquez was the Secretary of the Economy and Alvaro Santos was a part of the negotiating team of the USMCA. So I appreciate very much this conversation. Let me touch on a few subjects that I believe are important, and obviously I coincide with most of the things that have been said here, except with the fact that I have to solve all of these problems. I think I might solve some of them, but there are ones that are particularly complex. And I found really interesting what Alvaro said in the end about marijuana, so I'll react to that as well. Firstly, you asked about the challenges of this new stage of the US-Mexico relationship and the bilateral trade with the Biden administration. And I think it's very important to understand that there's a context to when this is happening, which is obviously the pandemic and the very deep economic crisis that this has left in the two countries. As you know, during the past year, we've had a very hard time to manage our shared border in terms of the flows of people in this very difficult moment. And one of the decisions that we've made was to try to not stall the flow of goods and trade between the two countries. So we have this policy of allowing essential travel to keep happening. But it's been a year. And that obviously is a thing that is very difficult to manage on both sides of the border. So as we move ahead in this pandemic and we start the vaccination process, it will be very important to think about how we can come back to an open border, or let me not say an open border, but to ease some of these restrictions gradually, so we can have a flow as we had before of people along the border. And that will depend in great measure of the efforts that we can do in both sides of the border to vaccinate people. Obviously, the US is moving very quickly in this process. Mexico is doing a lot of efforts in this area as well. But we will need to work together to do so, so we don't have a difference in terms of the situation of the pandemic that is so big that it doesn't allow us to reopen more broadly our shared border. Then secondly, and talking about the border as well, I mean, most of our colleagues have referred to the legal framework that the USMCA provides. And that is obviously very important. We've been in a process of liberalization of trade since the 90s with the NAFTA. And the USMCA maintained most of the policies for liberalization with some changes and rules of origin, for example. And evidently, it opened trade for some new areas. Somebody mentioned digital trade, and that is very important. I think it was Alejandrina. But something that is equally important are the non-tariff barriers that we have for trade in the border. The main barrier for trade between our two countries in the past decade has not been, the tariff barriers, but the waiting times along the border, which is where 80% of trade occurs. And that is something that we need to keep working in the future between the two countries if we want to actually increase trade, because in many points of the border, we've reached the maximum capacity of our ports of entry, and that creates an economic cost and an impediment to grow trade further. So it's going to be very important to move along in the modernization of some of these ports of entry, to modernize the inspection infrastructure so we can make that happen faster. And then to create new ports of entry, there's a big project in Otay East, and in Otay East we call it Otay 2 in California, in the San Diego, Tijuana region. But the most important thing of this project is that Caltrans is thinking of how can we link together the different ports of entry in California and create a smart border infrastructure that allows people, for example, to see the different waiting times for crossing in the border in real time, so they can make a decision of where they can cross faster. And that's going to be super important in this process. And then I will just finish reacting to what Alvaro said. That's a really interesting point. Canada has regulated marijuana some years ago. The US is moving along with that process as well. Several states, I think over 30 states in the US have regulated marijuana for medical or recreational use. Now we have Oregon which is doing a really interesting experiment, I think based on the Portuguese model, where they legalized, or they're trying to legalize all drugs and move to a harm reduction and public health approach. In Mexico, as Alvaro said, the Congress is discussing a new regulation for marijuana. So it's going to be very interesting to think about if there's a space in the coming years to have, an international market for cannabis and marijuana products. So that's a very good point. And I think it's something we need to start thinking about, because the reality is that all of the countries of North America are moving in that direction when talking about marijuana. So very good point, Alvaro. Thank you very much. And I'll leave it there so we can continue with the discussion.
Great, thank you very much, Roberto. So I found your issue of non-tariff barriers really instructive. I lived in San Diego for the last 20 years and was very aware of the San Isidro tax. You want to go from Tijuana to San Isidro, it could be 2 hours, it could be 4 hours, and that impediment, something that was a heavy blow to cross-border commerce. So thanks to the four of you, I think we put two big sets of issues on the table. One is thinking about promoting competitiveness, developing global value chains, which I would highlight is significantly important right now, given what I would argue is a weakness in the Chinese economy. China is beginning to cede territory in certain global value chains, and that creates an opportunity for the US and Mexico perhaps to go beyond their success in aerospace, automobiles, and medical devices into new areas. And then the other set of issues having to do what we might be able to think of as just broader issues in managing the border about flows of people, flows of drugs, and flows of goods. And there are some reasons for optimism in kind of both in both areas, because there's some concrete things that could be done. So I might kind of take those in order. And so Alejandrina, I might start with you and then go next to Graciela to talk about the competitiveness side, and then we'll come to Roberto and Alvaro on the border management more broadly defined side.
Yes, thank you. So I think I could frame your concerns regarding China as, in the context of this panel, I think the question would be more as how Mexico, the US, and of course Canada in the USMCA framework can reap the largest possible gains from this new framework that we are just starting USMCA to gain the competitiveness in the world. And I would add something else too, is how can we in the three countries use this framework also to contribute to the search for solution to different global concerns. Just to give an example, for example, we have a climate change. Should we be thinking about climate change in the framework of USMCA and the competitiveness that it might create, and therefore contribute to a global project? So I definitely agree that we have to make the best out of the USMCA framework as a region, as a whole. But you were mentioning two big topics that we were addressing. So one, it has to do with competitiveness. The other one with non-trade barriers. But I would like to add a third one that was put in the table, which is how do we promote growth in general? What's the role of trade in promoting growth? And here I would really like to make a comment, which there are no simple solutions for the growth questions, and we all know this. And this means that trade agreements, we do know that they can be part of the solution, that we do know that they promote welfare, but we have to acknowledge that they are not the only thing that promotes growth. And therefore, we need to think also about other policies, other changes in the institutional framework of the countries. You have a very nice paper, particularly talking about Mexico, how other institutional changes have to be performed. For example, you need to have competitive provision of production inputs so that firms can actually be more productive and therefore can participate more even in trade. We need to have high quality of education, just formal labor markets. And I'm just putting them on the table because there are so many topics that we have to address when talking about the institutional framework. And then this stronger institutional framework in turn can help us have reap higher benefits from the trade agreements. And I think I'll stop here for now.
That's great. Thank you, Alejandrina. your linking of kind of growth-oriented policies to trade-oriented policies kind of connects to something that Alvaro was mentioning about how trade policy on its own is not a development policy. And I think it's hard for governments to think about this. You can't talk about the labor market challenges of Mexico or the United States purely in trade policy terms. There's a bunch of other things that need to be on the table. Graciela, we look to your insights on these issues.
Well, that's exactly what you just said and Alejandra mentioned is the most important lesson from NAFTA, I think. That having a very strong trade agreement in building that allows Mexico to build an export platform was not enough for growth and for reducing inequality. That's what we learned from NAFTA. So we should not expect and we should not ask USMCA to provide what NAFTA didn't. So we now know that we need to complement domestic policies and regional policies, by the way, outside trade policies or besides trade policies, so that we can provide those benefits of that we can fully exploit the benefits of trade while resolving other growth problems. And in that, I think it's key just to make USMCA to go as smoothly as possible. And that's why it is very important, the theme of the topic of competitiveness. We need to build infrastructure in border crossing, that's important, but it's equally important to provide logistics centers throughout the Mexican territory. Otherwise, we will be development and we will see growth along the border, which was the result of NAFTA. So we need to build logistics centers in the southeast states in Mexico, trade facilitation, customs facilitation, so that, for instance, we can reach the eastern part of the United States, not through the Laredo border crossing, but maybe through other ports in Mexico. So in designing trade facilitation and custom facilities policies, we need to take into account that it's easy to go to the border, but it would be more beneficial if we integrate other parts of the country. And that's why projects like the transseismic train connecting the Pacific and the Gulf of Mexico, it's quite important, because that would allow some of these impacts beyond the production centers and beyond the border. And let me just touch briefly on the China issue. And the China issue is, even though it seems now clear that China is facing a problematic engagement in global value chains, that phenomenon was already present before USMCA and before the pandemic. What the pandemic did was it accelerated a process that was going on. And so what do we need to know? We need to know that the trade tension with China didn't go with Mr. Trump. It's present. And that was the pivotal element, so that we will see more of this tension, and we will see then more of the reshoring and nearshoring on to either Mexico, Central America, and even Canada. So what do we need to do is to make a trilateral plan so that we can make reshoring, nearshoring strategically. And by strategically, I mean completing value chains. We not only need, of course, FDI is always, foreign direct investment is always welcome. But what you really need is to complete those value chains, not only in the auto industry or in the aerospatial industry, but also in new industries that might be relevant for the two countries. So we need to make a trilateral plan to complete value chains. And again, I think we're forgetting here one big issue, that growth always requires innovation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Graciela. Your comments on the challenges that China represents to the region kind of connects to something that Alvaro said earlier, and that when you look at the Biden administration, you see a lot of continuity from the Trump administration on trade policy. You see it on China policy too. And we don't really know yet what the Biden administration is going to do that's new there. So turning to this kind of broader set of border issues that Alvaro and Roberto raised, what I found intriguing about that is it seems like there's some quite concrete things that can be done that on the small that might aggregate up into more significant change. Improving border logistics, thinking about concerted efforts on marijuana, and then also thinking about how we create more secure legal flows of workers across the border, which has to be part of any comprehensive immigration reform plan. And we have another Groundhog Day in the United States. Comprehensive immigration reform is coming back. Hopefully this time it might be more significant. So starting with you, Roberto, as you think about this constellation of issues, where would you start first? What would you think where the US and Mexico, the kind of the easiest gains are there to be made?
Thank you, Gordon. Well, I think firstly, to Dr. Márquez's point, I think it's very interesting also to think about the maritime trade and how that can affect growth in areas of Mexico that have not benefited from trade as much as the border. And I think that's a very important point. And back to your question of, let's say, the low-hanging fruits or concrete things that Mexico can do to modernize our port infrastructure, especially in Chiapas and Puerto Chiapas, in Lázaro Cárdenas, is also very important in order to grow trade in some of these regions. For example, the growth of the trade between Puerto Chiapas and the port of Guayneme in California is an example of how that can work in the benefit of areas of Mexico that have not traditionally benefited from trade. It's mainly bananas and some other fruits and vegetables that are being traded between those two ports. But concrete improvements in that infrastructure and the logistical support of our ports in the south, and obviously the connections of those ports with the rest of the regions is very important. And then back to the north, to the border region. Well, I think I mentioned the new ports of entry. There are three very big and concrete projects that are being worked by the two countries. One I mentioned is the Otay 2 project. The second is a second railway bridge crossing that Kansas City Southern is working on. And then the third is another port of entry in the Laredo region, Laredo 4 and 5. So those are concrete projects that could work for the benefit of the border. And then I mentioned the inspections. That is something that we can modernize as well to non-intrusive equipment that allows us to inspect cargo faster. In San Isidro, they are installing the first non-intrusive ARC to inspect cargo freight trucks in the San Isidro port of entry. So that is very, very important as well, and a concrete thing we can do. And then Dr. Márquez also mentioned the trade facilitation and custom facilitation policies. We have some provisions for that in the USMCA. Actually, there's a group that is created in the USMCA for that purpose, and that will be super important as well if we want to grow trade and decrease the waiting times that I mentioned. So I think that is another very concrete example of things we can do in the border. You mentioned also and Alvaro mentioned the flow of workers with formally and with documents, and that is something that has been growing in the past few years since probably 2010, I believe. We've seen a very steep increase in the number of workers that are going with temporary visas to the US. And in some years, it has been actually a higher number than undocumented migrants that have been found in the border. So that's very important. And the experience that Mexico can share with the US in this topic is that the more we have circular, documented, formal migration, the less we will have undocumented migration. And I mentioned the circularity part because it's very important to understand that many workers want to go to the US, for example, for the cropping season in the case of agricultural workers, and then come back to Mexico. But if they go without documents, then they are in a sense trapped in the US because they don't know if they can come back if they come to Mexico or to visit their families, their communities, etc. So formal migration to increase the number of workers that are going this way with the US and Canada is something that is not only makes economic sense for the three countries, but it also makes sense from the viewpoint of migration policy and the problems that we face on this topic along our shared border.
Thank you very much for that. I'm having temporary video difficulties, but I'm hoping you can all still hear me well. Alvaro, Roberto put some concrete steps on the table, which seem like a very constructive, doable. Some of those Mexico can take the initiative on. With your perch in Washington, D.C., are there initial signs coming out of the Biden administration that would lead you to prioritize the set of issues you think Mexico should take on first when it comes to these issues of labor, of border, of illegal drugs and security?
Thank you. Well, I think on migration, there's definitely interest and hope given the announcements of the Biden administration, but I think Mexico should keep pressing and bringing this to the integration agenda. The COVID-19 pandemic made that contradiction very real and put it in high relief, where on the one hand you had the US government putting pressure on Mexico to open its factories and basically reinitiate the regional supply chains for the production of medical supplies and emergency, and on the other hand deporting Mexican nationals and raiding communities, deporting Mexicans who also have families in the United States. So a very contradictory policy, and I think that the hope is that we can actually make that disappear or drastically reduce. And it will also show Mexico what kind of partnership the US has in mind. In terms of drugs, I think that the current drug policy of both governments, it's a disaster, and it has huge effects on both sides of the border. And it would be great to start channeling that to the formal economic relations. I think there's a great opportunity to regulate illicit markets, to not make them illicit, and to actually treat some of these substances the way we treat alcohol or tobacco or medicines, with high regulations that really put public health front and center, but that basically move it away from the control of drug cartels and from the criminal justice lens. In terms of labor, I think that's one of the big changes of the Biden administration, and it was reflected in the USMCA. I, by the way, think that this was a big problem, and it's part of what helps explain in some ways the effects of NAFTA, which is that we had an institutional framework in Mexico that was highly repressive of labor. It's a holdover of the PRI authoritarian regime that didn't change in 2000 with the democratic transition. And so we basically have workers and labor organizations that really can't bargain freely collectively. And so the market forces really don't operate when it comes to the labor market. And that has repressed wages, which was really an implicit policy of the government. And you can think about it as a policy of gaining competitive advantage through cheap labor, but it's clear that it was very short-sighted and that it didn't lead to the kind of growing or increasing added value generally. And so I think that the US had really important concerns in terms of social dumping, and this was included in the USMCA. It was obviously also part of the agenda of the new administration. So the new government wanted to do a labor reform, and this was a coincidence of interest. And I think this will be a huge aspect of the new relationship. Basically, the labor reform in Mexico, the rapid response panels in USMCA that are deemed to enforce this new legislation. And I think it's also an opportunity for Mexican firms to focus on gaining competitive edge elsewhere through increasing the process of production, innovating in technology, etc. I think it could actually improve the purchasing power of workers and help, to increase demand in the internal market. We'll see, but I think that's really important. What it's not in the USMCA is something similar for the US, which obviously is also a huge missed opportunity for labor groups in the US, because despite the many failures of NAFTA, it made clear that labor violations occur in all three countries. And the new USMCA left out agriculture, and it made the enforcement really asymmetrical for the US and Mexico. And I think that this will be on the agenda of the Biden administration, basically improving domestic rights for workers in the US, but it was an opportunity missed. And the last thing I want to say, and this echoes some of the things that both Graciela and Alejandrina said, is it's about I think the problem of integration in Mexico itself. So Mexico has a very polarized or dual economy with leading firms that are export-oriented, that have, really advanced modes of production, top-notch technology. They finance themselves in the, in the stock market. But they're very disconnected or delinked from the rest of the Mexican economy, where you have lagging firms that have outdated modes of production, a huge informal sector. And so the challenge, I think, for Mexico is how to integrate, not so much, or beyond integrating with North America, which is obviously part of the agenda, is how to integrate domestically these two big poles of its own economy. And that's where I think we need to think also very innovatively and strategically. How to use the USMCA for that. Great.
That segues very nicely into some of the questions that are coming across the transom here. And I'll throw these open to the group. We have just 5 minutes remaining, so ask if you would just to kind of keep your interventions to a minute or so. We have 5 or 6 questions about the impact of the USMCA, concerns about it possibly making Mexico less competitive, concerns about being a movement away from free trade, and concerns about the burdens that USMCA places on Mexico, perhaps making it even harder for places like Chiapas to get ahead through trade. So building on all the other things that you just put on the table, throwing it open to the group, your thoughts on the specific dimensions of the USMCA regarding Mexican competitiveness and impacts on labor?
Okay, let me just start by saying that there might be some chapters that reading alone might exactly have that result or that outcome, like reducing Mexican competitiveness. But not USMCA is not one chapter. USMCA is 34 chapters in which, taken together, they work for increasing the competitiveness of North America. Because as mentioned initially by Alejandrina, this is not about Mexican products, it's about North American products. So taking alone, it works that way, maybe, but we need to think in USMCA as a whole. And that allows me to talk a bit on the labor issue. The labor, which is new for this trade agreement and for many others in the world, and that would allow Mexico not to be competitive on labor. It need to be competitive on productivity, on including and adapting and adopting new technology. Thank you.
If I may.
Please.
So I just want to remind us why did we have a renegotiation of NAFTA towards USMCA, which we were at the brink of having the agreement breaking down altogether. And that, as I was saying, it was not good for the region as a whole. The NAFTA has given the three nations the opportunity to increase their productivity, increase their competitiveness. And we can talk about all the many other things that we as a region or countries in particular have to do to grow more. But NAFTA was definitely an engine for growth, and very important one for the case of Mexico. So we should not remember that we were facing, and I think we still are facing, the backlash against globalization. And that's something that USMCA will also face. And that's something that we have to think when trying to promote USMCA and all the other policies that will come together with it to increase growth in the region. Thank you.
Roberto, can we turn to you for a final word?
Thank you very much, Gordon. And I'll refer also to the labor issue. This is something that is very unique, that we included a chapter like that in a trade agreement. Alvaro mentioned that this coincides with the agenda of the Mexican government. That is something very important to say. In general, I would say that NAFTA created increases in productivity and the salaries of some workers who were in the areas that opened to trade and integrated with the supply chains in the US. But the reality is that there's a lot of wage inequality in Mexico and very low wages in some sectors. So the labor reform that the Mexican government is doing together with the new minimum wage policy are important factors that might lead us, or will lead us, I believe, to greater equality in income in our country because of the freedom of union, and obviously because of the increase in the minimum wage per se. So I think that is something that will be very important to follow. I believe that this won't be, as many think, a great source of tension between the two countries. Obviously, there will always be challenges in this so complex bilateral relationship. But hopefully, this new chapter, together with what Mexico is doing, will not only allow trade to keep growing, but it will also address the inequality issue that we have here in Mexico, and to a certain extent also in the US and Canada, where the ones that also were having tensions between their workers because of this competition with Mexicans with lesser working conditions. So I will finish on that note and thank again the Harvard University Mexican Association students for the invitation.
Great, thank you very much, Roberto. I think it's it's quite important you highlight this last issue of the commonalities of challenges regarding labor issues in the United States and Mexico. Both countries have regions that have been that have enjoyed tremendous growth because of globalization. Both countries have regions that haven't been able to take part in those same benefits. And that angst, that anger, the sense of being left behind has driven politics in both countries recently, with a surprisingly similar set of policy proposals being put on the table in the two places. So for your final word, Alvaro, what are your thoughts on this dimension?
I think that we're witnessing the transformation of globalization, and that the USMCA, it's a pivot of what might come in the future. And in concrete terms, we're seeing a rebalancing of the power of capital and labor. In the USMCA, we see it through the labor provisions that we just mentioned, but also a reduction of investor rights, which for the previous administration was basically an insurance for outsourcing or offshoring. And so I think we're seeing a rebalancing of the relationship between the state and foreign investors as well, so that the state can pass regulation for the public good, particularly for the environment and climate change, but also public health. And that we're thinking not only about the benefit that trade agreements could have on consumers, but also on workers. So there's a clear, just to echo the point you made, there's a clear emphasis on the distributional consequences of trade that I think had been somewhat put aside, thinking that countries can deal with those domestically through social insurance policy. And I think that that's now become front and center of trade policy, clearly in the US, and I think so also in Mexico. So I'll just close by saying there's an opportunity for North America, and particularly with this new emphasis on reshoring, there's an opportunity for Mexico to partner with the United States in trying to bring back production. And I hope that we can use that in Mexico to bring this part of the economy that I was saying was really delinked to supply and to be on board in the North American economic integration. But it's obviously a challenge. And I also want to thank my co-panelists, which is great to see again, and Uma for organizing this panel. Thank you, Gordon.
Alejandrina, we cut short your final word, and you took a very small bit of time, so I'd like to reallocate some time back to you to make a kind of a 1 minute of closing remark, if you would.
No, I think we shouldn't use the time of the next panel. So I just end by thanking for the invitation again. Thank you very much for the other panelists for the discussion, and thank you, Professor Hansen, for being here as well.
So I'd really like to thank the panel for just a great job in putting a set of issues on the table that are real, that are challenging, that are hard to deal with, but also put on ideas on the table for things that could push the US-Mexico relationship forward in new and in important ways. There's some things that are new about this moment. There's some things that are not. We kind of keep finding ourselves back in the same situation. But with the energy and ideas that you all provide, there's hope for progress. Thank you very much. It's been a privilege to be with you today.
Thank you.
Oh, bye-bye.